Now, let's take a look at the various sources of law in the United States. Now, obviously, the principal source of law in the U.S. is the U.S. Constitution. And that Constitution creates the basis for the system of government we have and establishes the three branches of government. So Article 1 of the Constitution creates the legislative branch, Article 2 creates the executive branch, and Article 3 creates the judicial branch. The legislative branch, known as Congress, is divided into two houses. One is the Senate and one is the House of Representatives. And broadly speaking, the legislative branch makes the laws, passes the statutes. And Article 1 has a number of areas in which Congress is allowed to legislate. One of the most popular for Congress to legislate is anything that impacts interstate commerce. And given that we have a modern economy where things cross borders from one state to another, a lot of human activity affects interstate commerce, and so Congress has a pretty wide berth in that area. Another part of Article 1 says that Congress can pass any laws that are necessary and proper for the carrying out of legislative activities, and obviously that's also a broad grant of legislative power. But it's not complete. And so there are areas that Article 1 doesn't cover, and in particular, those areas are ones that are specifically within one state, and therefore Congress can't legislate, and there the individual state would do the legislating. So Article 1, as I said, creates the legislative branch. Article 2 creates the executive branch, which includes the president, the vice president, and various executive officers, as well as a number of executive branch agencies, agencies like the State Department and the Defense Department and things like that. And we will come back in a later module and talk a little bit more about administrative agencies and how they function. Article 3 is the judicial branch, and the judicial branch obviously is the court system. And Article 3 establishes the U.S. Supreme Court, but only the U.S. Supreme Court. It wasn't actually necessary under the Constitution that any other federal courts would be created, but Article 1 does authorize Congress to establish federal courts, and Congress did use its Article 1 power and establish a whole set of federal courts right at the very beginning of the country. And now judges will review legislative enactments to make sure that those legislative enactments are consonant with the Constitution and all of its amendments, including the Bill of Rights. And this process is known as judicial review, where judges will review cases that raise the question of whether the legislature has overreached and violated the Constitution. This principle of judicial review comes from a very famous 1803 case called Marbury versus Madison, and since that time, courts have really had the ability to declare either a federal or a state law unconstitutional and invalidate it. So those are the three branches of government, and the idea of the Constitution is to create a system of checks and balances whereby each branch of government has specific power and authority, but they check and balance each other. So Congress passes a statute, the executive branch then puts that statute into effect, and the judicial review power means that that statute and the president's enactment of it all get reviewed by the courts. So each of the three branches has a role to play, and each one checks the other.